In the shadow of the Space Needle with the flag at half-staff, a couple hundred gathered to remember those lives cut short 18 years ago.
Present arms.
In the crowd, we saw laborers taking a moment to pause, and the salutes of first responders, some like Seattle firefighter A.J. Frank, who flew to Ground Zero days after the devastation and combed through the rubble, looking for signs of life with his search dog, Olin.
They're just doing their job, and I guess we were also looking for looking for anybody that left in the building or, firefighters that are in there.
You were there a week after. What did you find?
Parts. So that was it.
For many today, it's important to never forget that despair and the resolve that followed. Kathy Elder brought her granddaughter Finley from Arlington.
Everybody needs to remember, and I think if you all of a sudden stop talking about something because it hurts or because you're crying, then children aren't going to be able to grow up into a world where they know good and bad.
Mayor Durkin told me she too talked to her children today about what transpired after the tragedy, the good and the bad.
I think it's still stunning that we're still in Afghanistan and Iraq all these years later. But I also think to remember the lessons that we learned and the mistakes that we made and talk to our kids about that, because they're going to face similar challenges.
At Seattle Center, a memorial and moment to honor those past, emboldened for what's ahead.
9/11 will always be a dark day in our history. Our nation came together to grieve, but we also came together to rebuild.
Well, kind of closure and finally knowing what happened. We never knew what happened.
Chris Galvin was just 6 years old in 1967 when his family received the news that broke his mother's heart. Susan, the eldest of the 8 Galvin kids, had been murdered.
I mean, at the time, it was a taboo subject in our household.
It was a murder that had a big impact on police. Susan was just 20 and was one of their records clerks.
She had a serial number, 2657. That really hits home.
It was just 5 years after the World's Fair, and Seattle Center was the city's star attraction, and Susan had been strangled and sexually assaulted in the center's parking garage. Police dusted for prints and carefully collected her clothes, preserving everything so it withstood the decades. Potential killers were interviewed and detectives picked up the case over the years, but it wasn't until last year that familial DNA provided the link that police needed.
Frank Whippich was 100% certain to be the murderer of Susan Galvin.
But how officers got to Whippich, a one-time soldier and a security guard, wasn't easy.
And I would say it started with having this technology pop up and say, wow, I have a case that might meet the criteria for this.
Through a popular Ancestry DNA site, police linked the DNA found on Galvin with Whippich's relatives. But to solve the case, detectives needed one last crucial piece of evidence, and that took them here to this cemetery in Tukwila, where they exhumed the body of the man they suspected in this cold case killing. After exhuming the body, Whippich's bones were tested, and the DNA was a match. Today, Police Chief Carmen Best gave Chris Galvin the flag that was flying above police headquarters on the day investigators got the news about the DNA match.
And it is so important to us that we're able to do this for you and bring closure to your family, and that justice eventually gets served.
It's an ad campaign stretching thousands of miles. Leave the brutal heat and cold in the Midwest and join the Seattle Police Department in a city with a few days of sun and plenty of rain.
Recently, we've put up some billboards out in Indianapolis, Detroit, and Chicago.
Seattle police say they're always interested in new recruits, but what they really want are current police officers.
We can get an officer out on the street much faster as opposed to hiring a new person who's never done law enforcement.
SPD says in the days since these billboards went up, there has been plenty of interest.
Right now, we're hiring what we can.
Past Seattle mayors have said the city needs more than 70 officers. Mayor Jenny Durkin budgeted for 10 next year. But if you ask the head of Seattle's police union, that's nowhere near enough.
We are vastly approaching crisis.
Looking at the city's struggle to keep up with 911 calls, Stuckey says the city could use 400 more officers.
Well, our numbers are low, severely low, and you can't overtime it away, because at a certain point people get burnt out.
Stuckey says nearly 80 officers have already left the department this year alone.
The city has almost tripled, if not quadrupled, in size. And yet we're still policing with the same numbers from 1969.
And Stuckey says a good portion of the new hires should come from the area.
If we're really going to do recruiting, if we're going to we're talking about community policing, then we should probably be seeing some billboards here.
This isn't the first time that SPD is advertised in other cities. I remember them putting up a billboard in New York City in 2008. That time around, they had nearly 800 applicants, many from NYPD. In Seattle, Jennifer Sullivan, Como News.
The fire has moved past the structure along the tracks.
Jim Elsner was prepared to evacuate when he saw this fast-moving brush fire approach his land last Thursday right off Interstate 5.
Jumped the tracks, and then it caught that first tree on fire. It just went up like a torch.
The fire burned 3 sides of his property before firefighters got it under control. He went through a similar scare nearly 2 years ago to the day.
These guys earn every penny that they get, and they're here to save our properties.
That is why he's planning to support West Thurston Fire's levy that goes before voters next Tuesday. The money would help maintain the department's current staffing levels and operational costs at a time when calls for service have steadily increased over the last 5 years.
I think that this proposition is the most important public safety issue before this community.
If the levy fails, his department plans to issue layoff notices to 14 career firefighters, nearly half its workforce, and close 2 of its full-time fire stations. He says that could cause response times to double in some cases.
Of course I'm worried.
That'd be the worst thing in the world.
Elsner says the quick response here last week saved his home and his neighbors just up the road, a scare he hopes to never live through again.
As our climate seems to be changing on us and getting hotter summers and hotter summers, I mean, we need these guys more than ever.
Welcome to the 2018 Western pond turtle release.
The pond turtle is Washington's only native western species, so the only turtle we've ever had in the west side of the state is the western pond turtle. Anything other than that, like Jenny said, is a non-native introduced species.
The shell on the bottom, on the underside, like here, we call this the plastron. This is called the plastron on a turtle. So on the females, on the moms, it's flat. On the boys, it kind of caves in a little bit. It's got a little dip in there.
Kids between the ages of 4, 5, 6, that's probably the most impressionable stage of a child's development. And if we can reach them early and teach them about the importance of ecology and conservation, that's when people get hooked, if you will. That's how I got hooked as a kid.
It's his first time in the pond.
And you can see when these kids release the turtles, the looks on their face is just irreplaceable. I mean, it's a miraculous thing to see them let these turtles go, and you can kind of see that flash go off in their eyes.
Really cool and fun, because it's just fun, because you're like releasing a turtle, a real turtle, and I've never met a turtle before.
People think, oh, what's going to happen if the turtle goes away? But once that turtle goes away, there's a lot of things that depend on it that also will decline and could create a disruption in the ecosystem and create an unhealthy one. We know that at this point still the population would approach 0 after 20, 30 years. So right now this work is still necessary, but our goal ultimately is to not have to do the head starting anymore. We'd like to see this turtle be healthy again and have a robust population in our state and maintain itself on its own. It's one of my favorite days of the year when we do releases like this. It really is a great visual way to see all of your hard work go off into the sunset, if you will. You know, you get to see seeing your kids off to college. You know, it's bittersweet. You've worked with those animals for a year, but now they get to go back out into the wild and do their own thing, meet other turtles hopefully, and make more babies later on. That's our goal.